Number 10, the Hollywood myth. Hollywood has lied to you for decades. If you watch a modern blockbuster about ancient warfare, you are guaranteed to see the exact same visual trope. The warriors are encased in massive, gleaming shells of heavy metal. They move slowly. They swing their weapons with heavy, exhausted, clunky desperation. When they fall over, they struggle to get back up, trapped like a turtle on its back. We have been conditioned to believe that surviving an ancient battlefield was simply a matter of strapping as much heavy metal to your body as physically possible. But biology does not care about Hollywood tropes. The human body is an organic engine. When it fights, it generates massive amounts of internal heat. It burns calories at an astronomical rate. If you wrap that organic engine in a heavy, rigid shell of non-breathable bronze beneath the scorching Mediterranean sun, the enemy does not have to kill you. Your own biology will kill you. Your core temperature will spike. Your muscles will cramp. You will collapse from heat stroke long before a sword ever touches you. The greatest military commanders of the ancient world understood this biological limitation perfectly. And to bypass it, they completely discarded metal. Look closely at the legendary Alexander mosaic, unearthed from the ruins of Pompeii. It depicts Alexander the Great charging into battle against the Persian king Darius III at the Battle of Gaugamela. Alexander is about to conquer the known world, but he is not wearing a solid bronze breastplate. He is not encased in heavy iron. He is wearing a stiff, white sleeveless shirt. To a modern observer, he looks like he is riding into a lethal combat zone wearing a glorified piece of canvas. It looks suicidal. A heavy Persian arrow should tear right through that fabric and pierce his heart. But it didn't, because Alexander the Great was not wearing a simple shirt. He was wearing an ancient ballistic composite. He was wearing the linothorax. To understand how a piece of fabric could stop an iron-tipped arrow traveling at 200 feet per second, we must look at the physics of modern body armor. When a modern police officer wears a Kevlar vest, they are not wearing a magical force field. Kevlar is a synthetic plastic fiber woven into a highly dense net. When a bullet strikes the vest, the fibers do not bounce the bullet away. Instead, they catch it. They stretch, absorbing the kinetic energy of the projectile and dispersing that energy outward across the entire surface area of the vest, stopping the bullet before it can penetrate the flesh. The ancient Greeks did not have synthetic plastics, but they understood the exact same kinetic physics. The linothorax was engineered from flax, the plant used to make linen. But the Greeks didn't just weave a thick sweater. They took 15 to 20 separate, distinct layers of linen and fused them together. But they did not sew them. Sewing creates microscopic holes, which act as structural weaknesses. Instead, they bonded the layers using a highly specialized, water-resistant adhesive derived from boiled animal hides and rabbit connective tissue. They were creating a laminated composite material. When a heavy Persian arrow struck the linothorax, a brilliant sequence of biomechanical physics occurred in a fraction of a microsecond. First, the iron arrowhead pierced the outer layer of linen, but immediately it hit the hardened layer of animal glue. As the arrow pushed forward, it was forced to physically separate the glued layers from one another. In material science, this is known as delamination. Delamination requires a massive expenditure of kinetic energy. The arrow is literally burning up its own momentum just trying to break the chemical bonds of the glue. Simultaneously, the tightly woven linen fibers engaged in extreme microscopic friction. As the spinning arrow tried to force its way through the dense fabric lattice, the linen wrapped around the iron tip, acting like a brake pad. By the time the arrow breached the 5th, 6th, or 10th layer of the linothorax, its kinetic energy was completely drained. The projectile was caught in the fabric net, harmlessly suspended inches away from the warrior's vital organs. It was ancient Kevlar, but for centuries, modern historians looked at paintings and descriptions of the linothorax and scoffed. Because no physical example survived the decay of thousands of years, academics assumed the fabric armor must have been a cheap, inferior alternative for soldiers who couldn't afford real bronze armor. They refused to believe that cloth could rival solid metal, until modern science put it to the test. In the early 2010s, a team of researchers and historians at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay, led by Dr. Gregory Aldrete, decided to definitively test the physics of the linothorax. They sourced authentic, historically accurate, unspun flax linen. They harvested traditional animal hide glue. They painstakingly laminated patches of the armor exactly as the ancient Greeks would have done. Then, they took the ancient armor to a modern ballistic testing range. The researchers didn't hold back. They shot the linen composite with historically accurate arrows fired from high-poundage compound bows. They swung heavy axes. They stabbed it with swords. The The results completely shattered the academic consensus. The laminated linen effortlessly stopped the arrows. The heavy impacts dented the backing, but the fabric absolutely refused to let the iron points pass through. In fact, when the researchers tested the same arrows against a sheet of 2 millimeters thick mild steel, replicating a cheap bronze breastplate, the arrows punctured the metal. The cloth was mathematically superior to the metal, and more importantly, the cloth solved the biological bottleneck of the human body. A bronze cuirass is rigid. It does not flex when a soldier twists, bends, or swings a sword. It digs into the hips and restricts the diaphragm, forcing the lungs to work harder to pull in oxygen. It acts as a solar oven, trapping body heat and rapidly accelerating dehydration. The linothorax was custom fitted. It was stiff, but it could flex with the articulation of the human spine. It weighed significantly less than a solid bronze chest piece. It distributed its weight perfectly across the shoulders, drastically lowering the soldier's caloric burn rate. Alexander the Great did not conquer the Persian Empire because his soldiers hit harder. He conquered the Persian Empire because his soldiers were wearing a custom-engineered, load-bearing composite material that allowed them to march further, swing faster, and fight longer without their biological engines overheating. They hacked their own stamina. The linothorax is a masterpiece of environmental adaptation. The Greeks had vast fields of flax and abundant livestock for glue. They used the environment around them to engineer a biological shield. But what if you are born into an environment that has no flax? What if you live on a tiny, isolated coral atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean? You have no access to iron, you have no bronze, you have no large mammals for leather or glue, you have absolutely nothing but the ocean and the trees. Yet, your enemies are armed with swords lined with razor-sharp tiger shark teeth, weapons designed specifically to rip human flesh to shreds. How do you armor the human body using nothing but coconuts and toxic fish? You engineer a suit of armor that manipulates the very physics of kinetic impact. You build a fabric that is perfectly soft and flexible when you move, but the exact microsecond it is struck by a weapon, it instantly hardens into a rigid, impenetrable shell. Thousands of miles away from the battlefields of Greece, a remote island civilization was about to weaponize the physics of a non-Newtonian fluid. Number 9. Non-Newtonian bioarmor. A warrior steps onto the white sand of a coral beach. To a modern observer, he does not look like a human being. He looks like an alien monstrosity or a creature dredged from the nightmare depths of the ocean. He is entirely encased, from his ankles to his wrists, in a thick, coarse, dark brown suit. A massive, rigid collar rises high above the back of his neck, completely shielding the back of his head. But the most terrifying aspect of his silhouette is his helmet. He is wearing the hollowed-out dried corpse of a massive porcupine fish. Dozens of rigid, razor-sharp bone spikes protrude from his skull in every direction. He holds a long wooden spear lined on both sides with the jagged, serrated teeth of a tiger shark. He possesses absolutely no iron. He has no steel, no bronze, and no leather. Yet, he is wearing a suit of armor that utilizes kinetic physics so advanced, modern military engineers are actively trying to replicate its properties today. To understand the terrifying biomechanical genius of this warrior, you have to understand the extreme geographical isolation of the Kiribati Islands. Kiribati is a nation of coral atolls spread across a vast, empty expanse of the central Pacific Ocean. A coral atoll is not a volcanic island. There are no mountains. There are no veins of iron ore buried in the rock. There is no copper. There are no large land mammals to hunt for thick leather hides. From a military engineering standpoint, the environment provides absolutely nothing. Yet, human beings are incredibly inventive when it comes to violence. Because the warriors of Kiribati could not mine metal, they turned to the most lethal predator in their environment, the shark. They engineered swords, spears, and tridents out of dense coconut wood and meticulously lashed hundreds of tiger and great white shark teeth to the edges using human hair. If you have never seen a tiger shark tooth up close, you must understand its biological geometry. It is not shaped like a needle. It is shaped like a curved, serrated saw blade. It evolved over millions of years for one highly specific biological purpose: to violently rip through the dense blubber, muscle, and bone of sea turtles and whales. A shark tooth does not puncture cleanly. It catches, it saws, and it tears. If a Kiribati warrior swung a shark tooth sword across the bare chest of an enemy, it would not leave a clean surgical slice. It would act as a devastating biological chainsaw, instantly flaying the skin and ripping the muscle tissue to shreds. The victim would die of catastrophic blood loss and neurogenic shock within minutes. Faced with this horrifying weapon, the armorers of Kiribati had to engineer a defense. How do you stop a serrated biological saw when you have no metal? You weaponize a coconut. The dark brown suit the warrior wears is woven entirely from coir, the stiff, structural fibers extracted from the outer husk of a coconut. But the armorers did not simply knit a loose sweater. The women of the islands, who were the master engineers of these suits, soaked the coconut fibers in the ocean for months to strip away the soft organic material, leaving only the ultra-durable, high-tensile structural strands. They then took these strands and wove them into a hyper-dense, multi-layered lattice. When you touch the finished Kiribati armor, it feels rough and thick, almost like heavy modern carpeting. But its true genius only activates when it is struck by a weapon. In modern materials science, there is a concept known as a non-Newtonian fluid. If you have ever seen a liquid that flows softly when you pour it, but instantly hardens into a solid block, the microsecond you punch it, you have witnessed non-Newtonian shear thickening. Today, companies manufacture high-tech, flexible body armor out of materials like D3O, a non-Newtonian compound that moves with the human body but instantly locks up to absorb kinetic impact. The Kiribati coconut armor achieved this exact same kinetic locking effect purely through mechanical friction. When the warrior is walking, navigating the beach, or positioning his spear, the woven coir fibers are capable of bending. The armor allows for the articulation of the elbows and knees. It moves with his biology. But the microsecond an enemy warrior violently swings a shark-toothed sword into the suit, the physics of the armor instantly change. The extreme kinetic force of the strike causes the thousands of rough, microscopic coconut fibers to violently rub against one another. The sheer mechanical friction causes the lattice to instantly lock up. The flexible suit transforms into a rigid, impenetrable wall in a fraction of a second. When the serrated shark teeth hit that locked lattice, they cannot saw through it. The fibers are too dense and too tightly bound. Instead, the kinetic energy of the swing backfires. The teeth catch in the unyielding coir, and the sheer force of the impact causes the brittle shark teeth to literally snap off the enemy's weapon. The armor does not just protect the wearer, it actively disarms and destroys the weapon of the attacker. But stopping a sword swing to the chest is only half of the battle. In close quarters combat, the head and neck are the most vulnerable biological targets, and the Kiribati engineers protected the head by deploying psychological and biological terror. Look again at the helmet, the dried porcupine fish. It was not chosen simply because it looks intimidating. It was chosen for its precise biological architecture. A porcupine fish can inflate its body to deter predators. When it dies and is dried out by the islanders, it forms a hollow, incredibly rigid, lightweight sphere. But the true danger lies in the spikes. These spikes are razor sharp. In close quarters grappling, an enemy warrior might attempt to grab his opponent's head to drag him to the ground or expose his neck. If an enemy warrior's bare hand grabs the pufferfish helmet, the rigid bone spikes will immediately impale his palms, shredding his fingers. The helmet actively punishes anyone who tries to touch it. Furthermore, while the dried spikes themselves are physical deterrents, the porcupine fish contains naturally occurring tetrodotoxin, one of the most lethal neurotoxins on the planet. While the curing process mitigated the poison, the very presence of the fish on the battlefield acted as a terrifying psychological deterrent. You are fighting a man wearing a creature that can kill you simply by existing. And notice the high, rigid back collar of the woven suit. It rises several inches above the base of the skull. In Kiribati warfare, women and unarmored villagers would stand behind the front lines and hurl heavy stones and coral chunks at the enemy. The towering back collar was not designed to protect against the enemy in front. It was engineered to protect the warrior's spinal cord from friendly fire coming from behind. It is a flawless biomechanical masterpiece. Without access to a single ounce of metal, the islanders engineered a full-body, non-Newtonian kinetic shock absorber, topped with a biological deterrent, perfectly adapted to the specific weapons and tactics of a coral atoll. They manipulated friction and biology to survive, but Kiribati is an open, breezy island. The ocean wind constantly cools the warrior. What happens when you take armored combat out of the ocean breeze and plunge it into the most suffocating, humid, hyperthermal environment on Earth? What happens when you must fight in a jungle so relentlessly hot that the ambient temperature alone can induce a lethal biological failure? When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the New World, they marched into the jungle wearing the finest steel armor Europe could produce. And almost immediately, they began to die, not from enemy weapons, but from their own metal. To survive the jungle, they had to throw away their elite European steel and steal a piece of biological engineering from the Aztecs. They had to learn how to armor the human body against heat itself. Number 8. Extreme thermoregulation. A Spanish conquistador is slowly marching through the suffocating emerald canopy of the jungle. He is wearing a steel morion helmet and a polished steel breastplate. In the temperate, breezy climate of Western Europe, this armor is a masterpiece of military engineering. It is designed to deflect heavy swords, spears, and axes. But in the hyper-humid, blazing environment of the Mesoamerican jungle, the steel has become a lethal biological trap. The human body regulates its internal core temperature through a highly specific thermodynamic process, evaporative cooling. When you get hot, your body expels water, sweat, onto your skin. As the ambient air hits that water, it evaporates, pulling the heat energy away from your body and cooling your blood. But the conquistador has wrapped his torso in an impenetrable, unbreathable sheet of iron. The sweat cannot evaporate, the heat cannot escape. Instead, the radiant energy of the blazing jungle sun is absorbed by the polished metal, turning the breastplate into a literal solar oven. The temperature inside the armor rapidly spikes. The conquistador's brain begins to literally cook inside his skull. His heart rate skyrockets as it desperately tries to pump blood to his skin to cool down. He begins to experience severe hyperthermia, dizziness, and catastrophic muscle cramps. Without a single enemy arrow being fired, the Spanish soldier collapses into the mud, dying of heat stroke. His own armor has killed him, but watching him from the dark tree line is an Aztec jaguar warrior. The Aztec warrior is operating in the exact same blazing 100-degree temperature. He is exerting the same amount of physical energy. But his internal core temperature is perfectly regulated. He is not suffering from heat exhaustion. He is wearing the Ichcahuipili. To the dying Spanish soldier, the Aztec armor looks completely absurd. It does not look like armor at all. It looks like a thick, puffy winter jacket. Why would a warrior wear a heavy quilted coat in the middle of a sweltering tropical jungle? Because the Aztec engineers understood the laws of thermodynamics and kinetic dissipation better than the finest blacksmiths in Europe. The Ichcahuipili was constructed without a single ounce of metal. The Aztec armorers started by weaving 2 layers of fabric. But the true genius was what they packed between those layers. They did not use densely woven cloth, which would be stiff and heavy. They stuffed the armor with thick layers of raw, unspun cotton. But a puffy cotton jacket cannot stop a weapon. If a warrior swings a wooden club, the soft cotton will simply compress against the ribs. So, the Aztecs introduced chemistry. Once the thick cotton tunic was stitched together, the armorers completely submerged it in heavy, highly concentrated saltwater brine. They soaked the fabric until the unspun cotton deep inside was completely saturated. Then, they hauled the heavy wet armor out of the water and hung it under the blazing Mesoamerican sun to bake. As the water rapidly evaporated in the extreme heat, it left something microscopic behind. Millions of jagged, rigid salt crystals. These salt crystals embedded themselves directly into the cellular structure of the raw cotton fibers. The armor underwent a chemical petrification. When it was fully dried, the Ichcahuipili was no longer a soft, puffy jacket. The salt crystals had locked the cotton fibers together, turning the tunic into a rigid, highly abrasive, heavily padded composite shell that was up to 2 inches thick. In Chapter 1, we explored the terrifying molecular perfection of the Aztec macuahuitl, the wooden club lined with razor-sharp obsidian glass. The Ichcahuipili was explicitly reverse-engineered to defeat that exact weapon. If an Aztec warrior swung a 3-nanometer thick obsidian blade at a steel breastplate, the glass would shatter or slide off. But when that same microscopic glass blade struck the brine-hardened, unspun cotton of the Ichcahuipili, physics changed. The razor-sharp obsidian would slice through the outer layer of cloth, but immediately hit the 2-inch thick core of salt-petrified, unspun cotton. Because the cotton was unspun, the fibers were chaotic and tangled. They acted like a microscopic net. The incredibly sharp obsidian teeth would instantly become tangled in the dense cotton mesh. The friction would grip the blade, completely stopping its slicing momentum and trapping the glass weapon inside the padding before it could ever reach the flesh. Furthermore, the 2 inches of petrified cotton acted as a massive kinetic shock absorber, perfectly distributing the bone-crushing blunt force of the heavy wooden club across the entire torso. The Aztecs had engineered an armor that defeated the sharpest surgical edge on planet Earth. But what about the heat? How did this 2-inch thick jacket prevent the warrior from boiling alive in the jungle? This is where the biological hacking reaches its absolute peak. Unlike the Spanish steel breastplate, the Itka Huipili was organic. It was highly breathable. When the Aztec warrior engaged in high-intensity combat, his body naturally produced massive amounts of sweat. The thick, raw cotton actively wickeded that moisture away from the warrior's skin, drawing the sweat outward through the breathable layers of the armor. As the warrior moved, the ambient jungle air continuously flowed over the damp surface of the armor. This triggered massive, continuous evaporative cooling. The armor was actively pulling the heat away from the warrior's core. It acted as an ancient, wearable, non-mechanical air conditioning unit. The hotter the warrior got and the more he sweat, the more efficiently the armor cooled him down. The Aztec armorers had taken a thermal disadvantage and flipped it into a biological superpower. The biomechanical superiority of this armor was so absolute, it resulted in one of the most humiliating technological regressions in military history. When Hernan Cortés and his conquistadors realized they were physically cooking to death inside their expensive, state-of-the-art European steel, they made a desperate tactical decision. They stripped. According to the historical accounts of Bernal Díaz del Castillo, the Spanish soldiers literally unbuckled their elite steel cuirasses, threw them into the dirt, and scavenged the thick, brine-soaked cotton Ixcahuipili off the bodies of the dead Aztec warriors. The greatest ironworking civilization on the planet willingly discarded their metal and wrapped themselves in salt-crusted cotton simply to survive the ambient temperature of the battlefield. They realized that protecting the human body from a sword is entirely useless if the armor itself induces a fatal biological system failure. The Aztecs manipulated extreme heat. They engineered armor that actively breathed the surrounding air. But what if you need to do more than just breathe the air? What if you need to actively weaponize the atmosphere itself? What if you could design a piece of armor that manipulated aerodynamic pressure to create a localized, invisible force field capable of stopping a lethal projectile in mid-air? Halfway across the globe, the elite warriors of feudal Japan were about to use a piece of silk and the wind to defy the laws of ballistics. They were about to invent the horo. Number 7. The aerodynamic force field. An elite samurai messenger is riding a horse at a full, desperate gallop. He is a tsukaiban, a high-ranking courier handpicked by the warlord himself. In the chaos of a 16th century Japanese battlefield, before the invention of radios, these messengers were the absolute nervous system of the army. If a messenger was killed, orders were not delivered, flanks collapsed, and entire wars were lost. Because of this, the tsukaiban were the most high-value targets on the battlefield. As the messenger sprints across the open plains, a unit of enemy archers spots him. They draw back their asymmetrical Yumi bows, loaded with heavy, armor-piercing iron broadheads. They release a lethal volley, aiming directly for the messenger's back. But the messenger does not carry a heavy iron shield. Instead, billowing out behind him like a massive, brightly colored balloon is a sphere of silk fabric nearly 4 feet wide. To modern eyes, it looks entirely ridiculous. It looks like a flamboyant ceremonial cape meant to show off the samurai's high status. The heavy iron arrows arc through the sky, striking the massive silk sphere dead center. But they do not pierce the samurai's back. The moment the arrows touch the taut silk, they seem to hit an invisible, impenetrable wall. The lethal projectiles are instantly robbed of all their kinetic energy, bouncing off the fabric and dropping harmlessly into the mud. The samurai keeps riding. He survived because that massive balloon was not a ceremonial decoration. It was the horo. And it was not a piece of clothing. It was a mathematically precise, localized aerodynamic force field. For centuries, Western historians looked at woodblock prints of samurai wearing the horo and assumed it was purely ornamental, a way for commanders to easily identify their elite messengers in the fog of war. It is easy to make this assumption because a single sheet of silk cannot stop an arrow. If you hang a piece of silk from a wooden frame and shoot it, the iron broadhead will effortlessly slice through the delicate threads. But the Japanese engineers were not relying on the tensile strength of the silk to stop the arrow. They were relying on the air. The horo was constructed using several long strips of tightly woven silk stitched together to form a massive, continuous cape. When the samurai stood still, the cape hung limply down his back. But to ensure the aerodynamic physics worked flawlessly, the armorers invented the oikago, a lightweight spherical cage made of flexible bamboo or whalebone strapped directly to the back of the samurai's cuirass. The silk was draped over this cage. When the samurai spurred his horse into a full gallop, the forward velocity of the rider created immense atmospheric drag. The the ambient air rushed into the open front of the cape. Because the silk was so tightly woven, the air could not easily escape through the microscopic pores of the fabric. It became trapped. The massive cape violently inflated, pressurizing the interior cavity. The bamboo oikago cage ensured that the fabric maintained its perfect spherical geometry, preventing it from collapsing under the turbulent wind currents. The samurai was literally dragging a highly compressed bubble of atmosphere behind him. When the enemy arrow struck the horo, a brilliant manipulation of kinetic physics occurred. The arrow did not just hit a piece of cloth, it hit a pressurized pneumatic system. As the sharp iron tip pressed into the taut silk, the silk pushed inward against the trapped air. But air is a fluid, and when you rapidly compress a fluid inside a sealed container, it violently pushes back. In modern physics, this is the exact same mechanical principle that dictates how an automotive airbag saves your life in a high-speed car crash. The lethality of a projectile, or a car crash, is determined by impulse, the amount of kinetic force transferred over a specific amount of time. If an arrow hits a rigid steel plate, the time of impact is practically zero. All of the kinetic energy is transferred in a single armor-shattering microsecond. But when the arrow hits the inflated horo, the pressurized air compresses. The fabric stretches inward. It drastically increases the time it takes for the arrow to decelerate. By extending the duration of the impact by just a few milliseconds, the horo mathematically diffuses the peak kinetic force. The arrow spends all of its lethal momentum fighting the compressed air. By the time it actually touches the bamboo frame or the iron armor of the samurai underneath, it has no kinetic energy left. The samurai had engineered a wearable airbag 400 years before the invention of the automobile. This aerodynamic hacking was so terrifyingly effective that the horo became a revered, heavily protected piece of military technology. It was not just effective against arrows shooting straight on, it defended against the chaotic plunging arc of volley fire. Because the messenger was leaning forward on his galloping horse, the massive inflated sphere covered his entire back, his neck, and the rear flanks of his mount. It created a massive 360-degree aerodynamic blind spot that enemy archers simply could not penetrate. The engineers of feudal Japan looked at the surrounding atmosphere and realized it was not just empty space. It was a physical medium, and if you force that medium into a silk trap, you can weaponize it. They used the environment to build a localized force field. But the horo only worked because the atmosphere in Japan is generally temperate. Weaponizing the air is a brilliant biological hack when the air is warm and fluid. But what happens when the atmosphere itself turns into a lethal enemy? What happens when you have to fight a war in an environment so catastrophically cold that the very concept of metal armor becomes a biological death sentence? We must leave the warm, muddy plains of Japan and travel into the frozen, unforgiving nightmare of the Siberian Arctic, where the temperature routinely drops to negative 40 degrees Celsius. In this environment, if a warrior puts on a steel breastplate, they will be dead in an hour. Metal acts as a thermal bridge. It instantly sucks the heat out of the human core. Worse, if cold iron touches human sweat, it instantly freezes to the skin, causing severe, necrotic frostbite. And at negative 40 degrees, a heavy impact from a weapon will cause brittle iron to literally shatter like glass. How do you armor a human being when the periodic table itself begins to fail? You abandon metal entirely, and you turn to the ultimate naturally occurring kinetic shock absorber. You build your armor out of the dead. Number 6. Thermal kinetic shock absorbers. A warrior steps out of the blinding white mist of the Arctic tundra. He does not clink like a European knight. He rattles. His entire body, from his shins to the top of his head, is encased in hundreds of overlapping pale yellow plates. A massive, towering collar of rigid white spikes arcs over his shoulders, completely shielding the back of his neck. As he moves, the plates grind against one another with a hollow, terrifying skeletal sound. He looks like a reanimated monster, built entirely out of the bones of the dead. And from a strictly biological standpoint, that is exactly what he is. He is a warrior of the Chukchi, an indigenous Siberian people who inhabited one of the most hostile, geographically punishing environments on planet Earth. If you were to take a medieval European knight in a suit of polished steel armor and drop him into the middle of the Chukotka Peninsula in the dead of winter, the knight would be completely immobilized. In fact, his highly advanced, expensive metal armor would become the direct instrument of his death. To understand why metal fails in the Arctic, you have to look at the molecular physics of extreme cold. When the ambient temperature drops to negative 40 degrees Celsius, the laws of metallurgy fundamentally change. Iron and steel undergo a terrifying physical phase change known as the ductile to brittle transition. In temperate climates, steel is ductile. It has microscopic elasticity. If you strike a steel breastplate with a heavy sword, the metal microscopically bends and absorbs the kinetic shock, preventing the blade from cutting you. But at minus 40 degrees Celsius, the crystalline lattice of the steel freezes into a state of absolute rigidity. It loses all of its elasticity. If an enemy strikes a sub-zero steel breastplate with a heavy blunt weapon, the metal does not bend. It acts like a sheet of glass. It violently shatters, sending lethal, jagged metallic shrapnel directly into the wearer's vital organs. But kinetic shattering is only the second most dangerous problem. The first is thermal regulation. Metal has a tremendously high thermal conductivity. It is a heat sink. If a warrior wears a steel cuirass in the Arctic, the metal acts as a thermal bridge between the minus 40 degrees Celsius atmosphere and the warrior's 37 degrees Celsius biological core temperature. The steel will instantly and aggressively suck the heat out of the human body, radiating it away into the wind. The warrior will die of catastrophic hypothermia in less than an hour. Worse, combat requires physical exertion. Exertion creates sweat. If a warrior's warm, damp skin comes into contact with supercooled iron, the moisture instantaneously freezes, molecularly bonding the human epidermis to the metal. If the warrior tries to take the armor off, he will violently rip his own skin and muscle tissue from his bones. The Chukchi engineers understood this catastrophic environmental limitation. They knew they could not use metal to stop weapons, so they turned to the most advanced kinetic shock absorber in the natural world. They built their armor out of walrus ivory, whalebone, and reindeer antlers. At first glance, wearing bone armor seems primitive, a desperate act by a civilization that simply hadn't discovered iron. But scientifically, bone is a hyper-advanced composite material. Unlike steel, which is a rigid crystalline lattice, bone is a biological hybrid. It is composed of hydroxyapatite, a hard, rigid mineral suspended in a matrix of collagen, a soft, flexible protein. This millions of years old biological engineering makes bone incredibly resilient. Because of the flexible collagen matrix, bone does not suffer from a ductile to brittle transition in extreme cold. At minus 40 degrees Celsius, bone retains its microscopic elasticity. When an enemy arrow or spear struck the Chukchi bone armor, the walrus ivory did not shatter like frozen steel. It flexed, it compressed, it safely absorbed the kinetic energy of the impact without fracturing. The Chukchi armorers enhanced this biological shock absorption through their manufacturing process. They did not carve massive single pieces of bone to cover the torso that would restrict movement. Instead, they carved hundreds of small rectangular plates. They punched tiny holes into the edges of the ivory and laced them together using thick strips of leather and animal sinew. This is known as lamellar armor. When a weapon hit a single plate of ivory, the leather bindings allowed the plate to shift slightly, transferring the kinetic energy of the strike into the surrounding plates. The kinetic shock rippled across the armor like a stone dropped in a pond, perfectly dissipating the lethal force before it could reach the warrior's internal organs. But the most critical advantage of bone is its thermal properties. Bone is highly porous. It has incredibly low thermal conductivity. When the Chukchi warrior marched through the sub-zero blizzard, the bone armor did not act as a heat sink. It acted as an insulator. It trapped the warrior's body heat, keeping his biological engine perfectly regulated. And because bone is organic, it completely eliminated the threat of the armor freezing to the warrior's sweat. The Chukchi had essentially taken the biological architecture of an animal skeleton and wrapped it around the outside of their own bodies. They built an external skeletal system that outperformed advanced metallurgy in every single metric. We know this ancient armor was technologically superior because history provided a brutal, real-world stress test. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the Russian Empire expanded eastward into Siberia. They sent elite regiments of Cossacks, heavily armed, battle-hardened soldiers equipped with steel armor, iron sabers, and early gunpowder muskets. The Russian Empire expected to effortlessly crush the indigenous tribes. Instead, they walked into a slaughter. The Russian steel failed in the deep freeze. Their weapons chipped and shattered. The Cossacks froze to death inside their own armor. Meanwhile, the Chukchi warriors, encased in their articulating suits of walrus ivory and whalebone, moved fluidly through the blizzards. The bone armor was so kinetically resilient that historical Russian accounts report the Chukchi warriors taking direct hits from early musket balls at a distance, the ivory plates absorbing the lead impact and keeping the warriors fighting. The Chukchi fought the Russian Empire to a bloody, grinding standstill, forcing the massive superpower to abandon military conquest and sue for a diplomatic peace treaty. The ultimate kinetic shock absorber is not metal. It is the biological bone that nature spent millions of years perfecting. But bone has a physical limitation. You are constrained by the size of the animal you harvest. A piece of walrus ivory can only bend so much before it snaps. A reindeer antler is incredibly difficult to carve into microscopic, highly articulated shapes. What if a civilization lived in a temperate climate with massive veins of iron ore, but they understood the biological necessity of fluid motion? What if you could take rigid, heavy, unyielding iron and force it to behave like human skin? In the 3rd century BC, a tribe of Celtic blacksmiths was about to completely break the rules of solid-state physics. They were about to invent a process that turned heavy metal into a kinetic fluid, perfectly mapping the biological articulation of the human body and eliminating joint restriction forever. Number 5. The fluid metal skin. The sound of the ancient forge is not the deafening explosive crash of a heavy hammer smashing a glowing sheet of bronze. It is a delicate, rhythmic, microscopic tapping. Click, tap, click, tap. A Celtic blacksmith sits hunched over a tiny anvil. He is holding a pair of iron tweezers and a microscopic metal rivet, no larger than a grain of sand. He is carefully threading a small, open ring of iron through 4 other closed rings, before gently tapping the rivet into place to seal the loop. He is going to repeat this exact, agonizingly precise microscopic motion 30,000 times. He is not building a rigid shield. He is completely overriding the rules of metallurgy. He is turning heavy, unyielding iron into a fluid. He is inventing chainmail. To understand why this invention completely altered the trajectory of human warfare, we must look at the biomechanical limitations of the human torso. The human body is not a static cylinder. When a warrior breathes heavily, their ribcage expands and contracts. When they swing a weapon overhead, their spine twists, their latissimus muscles stretch, and their shoulder, a highly complex ball and socket joint, rotates through a massive arc of mobility. Before the 3rd century BC, armorers fought against this biology. The standard armor of the ancient Mediterranean world was the bronze cuirass, a massive, solid, bell-shaped tube of cast metal. A bronze breastplate provides excellent defense, but it is a biomechanical nightmare. Solid metal does not stretch, it does not twist. If a Greek hoplite wearing a bronze cuirass tries to raise his arm high into the air, the rigid edge of the metal breastplate aggressively bites into his armpit and his collarbone. The armor physically restricts his range of motion. It dictates how he can move. To gain absolute protection, the warrior had to sacrifice biological articulation. The Celtic blacksmiths looked at this mechanical compromise and rejected it entirely. The Celts were frequently dismissed by the Greeks and Romans as uncivilized barbarians. But in reality, they were some of the most advanced metallurgical engineers of antiquity. They realized that if you want to armor the human body without restricting it, you cannot treat metal like a wall. You must treat metal like a fabric. They drew iron into long, thin wires. They wrapped the wire around a metal rod, sliced it into thousands of tiny individual rings, and interlocked them using a highly specific mathematical pattern. The pattern is known as the 4-in-1 weave. Every single individual iron ring passes through 4 other adjacent rings. When you link 30,000 rings together using this topology, the iron undergoes a terrifying physical transformation. It loses its rigid macrostructure. It becomes a dense, heavy, metallic liquid. When a Celtic warrior pulled a shirt of chainmail over his head, the metal draped over his body like water. It possessed zero structural rigidity of its own. Instead, it mapped perfectly to the exact biological contours of the wearer. When the warrior twisted his spine, the rings seamlessly slid over one another, allowing the armor to twist with him. When he took a deep, exhausted breath, the thousands of linked rings expanded outward, allowing his diaphragm to fully inflate without restriction. It did not fight his biology. It mirrored it. The Celts had engineered a secondary, impenetrable metallic skin. And against the primary weapons of the ancient world, this fluid skin was devastatingly effective. If an enemy swings a razor-sharp sword at a warrior wearing chainmail, the physics of the cutting edge completely fail. To slice through an object, a blade must find a continuous surface to bite into, using microscopic friction to separate the material. But chainmail has no continuous surface. It is entirely composed of interlocking curves and empty space. When the sharp edge of the sword hits the iron rings, the high tensile strength of the interwoven loops refuses to separate. The blade physically cannot catch an edge. It skips, slides, and deflects across the fluid surface of the rings. The kinetic energy of the swing is violently dispersed across the thousands of micro rivets, leaving the warrior completely unscathed by the cut. This biomechanical hack was so profoundly superior to rigid bronze plates that when the Roman Republic encountered the Celts in battle, they experienced a profound technological shock. The Romans, renowned for their military engineering, looked at their own rigid, restrictive chest plates and then looked at the terrifying fluid speed of the Celtic warriors. The Romans did what they always did when faced with superior engineering. They stole it. The Roman legions entirely abandoned their rigid bronze plates and mass-produced the Celtic invention, renaming it Lorica Hamata. It became the standard issue armor that allowed the Roman war machine to conquer the known world, offering their infantry unparalleled mobility on the battlefield. But physics demands a ruthless compromise. You cannot have perfect flexibility without sacrificing something else. Chainmail is a miracle against a slashing blade, but what happens when the enemy stops trying to cut you and simply tries to crush you? What happens when an enemy swings a heavy, solid iron mace or a lead-weighted club? Because the fluid metal skin has absolutely no structural rigidity, it cannot absorb blunt force trauma. When a heavy mace strikes a shirt of chainmail, the iron rings do not break. They do their job perfectly. But because the armor is resting directly against the warrior's body, 100% of that massive kinetic shockwave is transferred instantly through the rings, directly into the flesh and bone underneath. The armor remains perfectly intact. But the warrior's ribcage is shattered into a dozen pieces. Their internal organs hemorrhage from the blunt force shock. A fluid skin cannot stop a crushing blow. To solve this fatal flaw, the Roman military-industrial complex realized they needed to engineer an impossible hybrid. They needed the flawless biological articulation of the Celtic chainmail, combined with the rigid, kinetic deflecting properties of solid metal plates. They needed to build a material that did not exist in human metallurgy. So they looked up at the sky. They observed the biological architecture of apex avian predators and decided to biomimetically replicate the exact anatomical structure of a bird of prey. They were about to engineer an armor so mathematically complex and insanely expensive, it was reserved only for the absolute elite of the Roman Empire. Number 4, biomimetic anatomical scaling. A Roman general steps out into the gray, hostile light of a Germanic morning. He is not wearing the iconic, overlapping iron bands of the standard Roman legionary, nor is he wearing the fluid iron chainmail of the auxiliary infantry. As he moves toward his horse, his armor shimmers and ripples in the dim light. It does not reflect the world like a solid sheet of metal. It catches the ambient light as thousands of individual, distinct textures. As he raises his arm, the metal shifts and flows, snapping perfectly back into place when he drops it. He looks less like a human soldier and more like a massive, metallic bird of prey. He is wearing the lorica plumata, the feathered armor. To understand why this specific, hyper-rare piece of military equipment exists, we must remember the brutal kinetic compromise we discovered in the last chapter. Chainmail is perfectly fluid, offering flawless biological articulation. But it is soft. It cannot stop the bone-shattering blunt force of a heavy mace or a crushing downward broadsword strike. The engineers of the Roman military-industrial complex faced an impossible mechanical paradox. They needed a material that was rigid enough to absorb and distribute catastrophic, blunt force trauma, but fluid enough to allow an elite commander to twist, ride, and fight without fighting the very metal he was wearing. Because human metallurgy possessed no single material that could achieve both, the Roman armorers stopped looking at the forge. They looked up at the sky. They observed the biological architecture of apex avian predators, hawks and eagles. A bird's plumage is a masterpiece of kinetic and environmental deflection. It is made of thousands of individual feathers. Each feather features a rigid, microscopic central spine, the rachis, that provides structural integrity. Yet, because these feathers overlap one another like shingles on a roof, they do not restrict the bird. When a hawk tucks its wings into a 150-mile-per-hour dive, the feathers slide seamlessly over one another, creating a perfect, fluid, aerodynamic surface that protects the fragile skin underneath without ever restricting the highly complex articulation of the wing joints. The Romans decided to mathematically replicate this exact biological architecture in iron and bronze. They executed a piece of biomimicry so labor-intensive it bordered on madness. To build the lorica plumata, the Roman armorer first had to construct a flawless, highly tailored shirt of iron chainmail, the 4-in-1 matrix invented by the Celts. That alone took thousands of hours of microscopic riveting. But for the feathered armor, the chainmail was merely the undergarment, the canvas. Next, the armorer took sheets of bronze or copper alloy and stamped out thousands of microscopic, feather-shaped scales. But these were not simply flat pieces of metal. Using a specialized die, the armorer stamped a distinct, raised vertical rib down the exact center of every single scale. Just like the central spine of a bird's feather, this raised rib exponentially increased the structural rigidity of the tiny piece of metal, completely changing its kinetic geometry. Then came the agonizing part. Using tiny microscopic wire rings, the armorer manually attached the top of each individual rib scale directly to the interlocking rings of the underlying chainmail mesh. They wired thousands of rigid metal feathers to a fluid metal skin. When the Roman general stepped onto the battlefield wearing this masterpiece, the biomimicry activated perfectly. Because the scales were wired tightly at the top but left loose at the bottom, they overlapped. When a heavy Germanic broadsword swung down, aiming for the general's shoulder, it did not hit a fluid ring that would crush into his collarbone. It hit the ribbed bronze scales. The vertical ribbing caught the strike, preventing the blade from biting. The rigidity of the scale instantly distributed the kinetic energy of the impact across the surface of the overlapping plates beneath it, severely mitigating the blunt force trauma. Furthermore, the steep, downward angled overlap of the feathers created a flawless glancing surface. The enemy blade had nowhere to catch. It was physically forced to slide harmlessly off the armor, directing the lethal kinetic energy away from the human body. But because those rigid scales were independently wired to a fluid chainmail backing, the armor remained completely articulate. When the general twisted his torso to throw a spear, the metal feathers seamlessly slid over one another. He possessed the absolute kinetic protection of rigid plates married flawlessly to the unrestricted biological articulation of a fluid skin. It was the perfect armor. So why did the Roman Empire eventually collapse? If they possessed the perfect biological defense? Because the mathematics of its production were completely unsustainable. A standard Roman chainmail shirt contained roughly 30,000 rings. To create lorica plumata, a master armorer had to independently stamp, rib, and wire tens of thousands of scales onto that moving mesh. Historians and modern armorers estimate that it took a master blacksmith up to 2 years of continuous, grueling manual labor to produce a single suit. It was so insanely expensive and required such an astronomical level of highly specialized metallurgical skill that it could never be mass-produced for the legions. It was reserved exclusively for the absolute apex of the Roman military hierarchy, tribunes, legates, and emperors. It was the ancient equivalent of a multi-million-dollar custom-fitted combat exoskeleton. The Romans used biomimicry to create the perfect hybrid of rigidity and motion. They mimicked the scales of an animal to protect the fragile human form. But what if you didn't just want to mimic biology? What if you wanted to fundamentally upgrade the human skeleton itself? 1,000 years before the city of Rome even existed, on the rocky shores of the Mediterranean, Bronze Age engineers achieved something that modern historians thought was physically impossible. They built a piece of armor that looked so massive, so incredibly clunky, and so unwearable that for over half a century, academics assumed it was just a ceremonial prop. They believed no human being could physically fight inside it. Until modern scientists put it on a treadmill and realized the ancient Greeks hadn't just built a suit of armor. They had engineered a load-bearing mechanical exoskeleton. Number 3, the Bronze Age exoskeleton. A warrior steps onto the dry earth. He does not look like the agile, bare-chested Greek heroes depicted in Hollywood movies or Renaissance marble statues. He looks like a terrifying primitive tank. He is entirely encased in massive, heavy plates of beaten bronze. A high, rigid bronze collar rises completely past his chin, engulfing his neck and lower face. His shoulders are covered by massive, curved bronze pauldrons that look like the overlapping plates of a colossal insect. Below his breastplate, 3 thick, curved bands of tubular bronze encircle his torso, dropping down to his knees. On his head sits a helmet woven entirely from the razor-sharp tusks of wild boars. He looks incredibly heavy. He looks completely immobile. If he falls over, it seems biologically impossible for him to stand back up. When archaeologists excavated an ancient tomb in the Greek village of Dendra in 1960, they unearthed this exact, perfectly intact suit of armor. It became known as the Dendra panoply. It is one of the oldest complete suits of metal armor ever discovered on planet Earth. But for over 60 years, the academic community looked at this Bronze Age artifact and completely dismissed its military value. Historians and biomechanics experts calculated the sheer weight and the restrictive tubular geometry of the bronze plates. They concluded that it was an evolutionary dead end. The academic consensus stated that the Dendra panoply was purely ceremonial. They assumed it was a status symbol meant to be worn on a slow-moving chariot or buried in a tomb, arguing that if a human being actually tried to sprint, swing a sword, or fight in this rigid metallic tube, their biological limits would completely buckle under the strain. They were wrong. They fundamentally misunderstood the biomechanical genius of the Bronze Age engineers. To understand the brilliance of this armor, we must understand the engineering flaw of the human spine. The human spinal column is essentially a delicate stack of biological teacups separated by soft, fluid-filled discs. It is incredibly flexible, but it is terrible at bearing heavy, localized vertical loads. If you take 50 pounds of raw weight and strap it directly to a human being's shoulders, like a heavy bronze breastplate, gravity immediately attacks the cervical and thoracic spine. The trapezius muscles scream under the tension. The spinal discs compress. The warrior's center of gravity becomes dangerously top-heavy, completely destroying their balance and draining their caloric reserves in a matter of minutes. The engineers of Mycenaean Greece understood this biological limitation 3,500 years ago. They realized that you cannot hang heavy metal off the human spine. You must bypass the spine entirely and transfer the kinetic load to the strongest mechanical structure in the human body, the hips. In 2024, a team of researchers led by Dr. Andreas Flores at the University of Thessaly decided to finally test the true physics of the Dendra panoply. They didn't just put the armor on a mannequin, they recruited 13 elite, highly conditioned Marines from the Hellenic Armed Forces. The researchers forged exact, historically accurate replicas of the massive bronze suit. They strapped the modern Marines into the armor and ordered them to execute a grueling 11-hour combat simulation based entirely on the specific, brutal, martial algorithms described in Homer's Iliad. Sprinting, thrusting spears, swinging heavy swords, riding chariots, and engaging in high-intensity, close-quarters combat. If the academics from the 1960s were right, the Marines should have collapsed from exhaustion, restricted mobility, and spinal pain within the first hour. Instead, the modern Marines executed the entire 11-hour combat protocol, flawlessly. The researchers hooked the soldiers up to modern kinesiology sensors, metabolic trackers, and thermal imaging. When they processed the data, they discovered that the Dendra panoply was not a clunky, primitive tube. It was a fully functional, load-bearing mechanical exoskeleton. The secret to the armor's impossible mobility was hidden in its bizarre geometry. The massive curved bronze shoulder guards did not rest their weight on the soldiers' collarbones. They were engineered to act as a structural arch. They locked into the heavy breastplate and the overlapping tubular bands around the waist. When the warrior strapped the armor tight, the overlapping bronze plates engaged. They functioned identically to the internal frame of a modern $500 high-tech hiking backpack. The rigid tubular bands caught the massive weight of the upper bronze plates and completely bypassed the human spine, channeling the heavy kinetic load straight down into the warrior's pelvis and core. The armor physically held itself up. Because the weight was perfectly mathematically distributed to the warrior's center of gravity, the Marines could sprint, pivot, and strike with terrifying fluidity. The massive neck guard that looked so restrictive was actually engineered to sit just far enough away from the jawline to allow for heavy, exhausted breathing without choking the warrior, while creating an impenetrable, deflecting surface against enemy spears. The ancient Greeks had engineered a wearable metallic skeleton on the outside of the human body. This discovery completely rewrites the reality of ancient warfare. When we envision the legendary Trojan War, the clash of Achilles, Hector, and Agamemnon, we are not looking at men fighting in simple tunics and leather straps. We are looking at Bronze Age super soldiers. They were wearing highly advanced, weight-distributing exoskeletons that allowed them to fight for hours while entirely encased in impenetrable heavy metal. They possessed a mastery of ergonomics and load-bearing physics that modern militaries are only just beginning to replicate with titanium frames and robotic assist suits. The Greeks pushed the biological human engine to its absolute maximum potential. They armored the man flawlessly, but eventually, military engineering hits a hard physical ceiling. No matter how perfectly you distribute the weight of the armor, you are still relying on the biological output of 2 human legs. A human being can only run so fast. A human being can only generate a finite amount of kinetic momentum when charging an enemy line. To break that ceiling, ancient armorers realized they had to upgrade the engine. They had to look past the human body and armor a beast. If you take an elite warrior and put him on a horse, you have cavalry. But if you armor both the man and the beast in an interlocking matrix of steel scales and fuse their biomechanics together through a specialized saddle, you do not just have cavalry. You create a single, unified 2,000-pound biological missile. The Sassanid Persian Empire was about to unleash the ultimate kinetic battery. Number 2, the symbiotic kinetic battery. The earth is vibrating. A Roman infantry line stands in tight formation, their heavy wooden shields locked together to form a defensive wall. They are bracing for a cavalry charge. In the ancient world, infantry lines defeat cavalry by relying on physics. A horse is biologically terrified of running into a solid wall of sharp spears. Usually, the horses will veer away at the last second, but the enemy charging them through the desert dust is not acting like normal cavalry. As the dust clears, the Romans do not see men riding horses. They see a solid, continuous wall of shimmering steel moving toward them with terrifying, methodical momentum. Not a single patch of biological flesh is visible. The riders are encased in overlapping iron scales. Their faces are hidden behind expressionless iron masks, but more horrifyingly, the massive war horses they are riding are also completely sheathed in metal. From their hooves to their eyes, the animals are wrapped in thousands of interlocking iron and bronze plates. The Romans are facing the Savaran, the elite cataphracts of the Sassanid Persian Empire, and they are about to be annihilated by a weapon system that fundamentally changes the mathematics of kinetic energy. To understand the biomechanical genius of the cataphract, we must look at the physical limitations of a man riding a horse. Biologically, a human and a horse are two entirely separate entities, connected only by gravity and friction. If a traditional cavalryman charges an infantry line and thrusts his spear into an enemy's shield, Sir Isaac Newton's third law of motion dictates a brutal reality. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. The kinetic force of hitting the shield instantly pushes back against the spear, travels up the rider's arm, and hits his torso. Because the rider is not physically fused to the horse, that violent reverse kinetic energy will instantly blow the rider backward, ripping him right off the animal's back. A traditional cavalryman cannot use the full speed and weight of his horse in a strike. He can only use the strength of his own arm. The Sassanid engineers looked at this biological disconnect and they engineered a solution to eliminate it entirely. They did not want a man riding a beast. They wanted to fuse two distinct biological systems into a single symbiotic kinetic battery. To achieve this, the Sassanid armorers engineered the four-horn saddle. This was not a soft leather cushion. It was a highly rigid, structural wooden frame built directly over the horse's spine. The saddle featured four massive curved wooden horns, two locking over the rider's upper thighs and two wrapping tightly behind his pelvis. When the heavily armored cataphract slid into the saddle, his skeleton physically locked into the skeletal structure of the horse. The biological disconnect was erased. The man and the horse now shared a single, unified center of gravity. This biomechanical fusion allowed the Sassanid rider to wield a weapon that should have been physically impossible to use, the kontos. The kontos was a massive, 12-foot-long, heavy wooden lance. It was so heavy that it could not be held with one hand. The cataphract had to drop his reins, guiding the horse entirely with his knees, and grip the massive lance with both hands, driving it firmly across the horse's neck. When the cataphract charged, the kinetic physics were catastrophic. Because the rider was locked into the four-horn saddle when the heavy kontos struck a Roman shield, the reverse kinetic energy did not throw the rider backward. The energy traveled down the lance, through the rider's locked pelvis, and was dispersed directly into the massive, forward-moving momentum of the 1,500-pound armored warhorse. The weapon was no longer being thrust by the muscles of a human arm. It was being driven by the combined rigid mass of 2,000 pounds of galloping steel, horse, and man. Mass multiplied by velocity equals momentum. When this symbiotic kinetic battery struck the Roman infantry line, it did not just pierce a single man. The sheer, overwhelming mathematical force of the impact shattered the entire structural integrity of the shield wall. The localized kinetic shockwave threw fully armored Roman legionaries through the air like ragdolls, instantly trampling the formation into the desert dirt. But engineering a 2,000-pound biological missile requires a specialized engine. You cannot drape a normal horse in 100 pounds of iron barding and expect it to sprint through the desert. The animal's heart would explode, and its legs would shatter under the extreme compressive force. To power this weapon system, the Sassanids utilized genetic engineering. Centuries of selective breeding produced the Niazian warhorse. These animals were biological anomalies, massive, thick-necked, and possessing hyperdense skeletal structures specifically bred to bear extreme mechanical loads. Their cardiovascular systems were heavily conditioned to pump blood efficiently even while draped in layers of heavy, heat-trapping iron scales. The Sassanids took the ultimate apex animal of the ancient world and turned it into the chassis of a living tank. By scaling up the armor, by fusing the rider to the beast, and by engineering an armored shell that covered both, the cataphract represented the absolute peak of brute kinetic force. But history is a ruthless physics equation. Brute force has a hard physical ceiling. If your only defensive strategy is to make your armor thicker to absorb heavier hits, you eventually hit a breaking point. The metal becomes too heavy. The biological engine, whether it is a human or a Niazian horse, collapses under the weight of its own protection. By the late Middle Ages, the arms race of human combat had reached this exact crisis. Weapons had become so devastating, massive halberds, heavy maces, and mechanical crossbows, that simply adding thicker layers of iron to a warrior was no longer biologically viable. To survive, the greatest armorers in human history realized they had to completely abandon the philosophy of absorbing kinetic energy. They had to bend the math of the metal to deflect the physics entirely. They were about to forge the absolute pinnacle of human biomechanics. They were about to build a suit of steel that completely shattered the Hollywood myth of the slow, clunky knight. They were about to invent the glancing surface. Number 1, the ultimate glancing surface. A fully armored 15th century knight stands in the center of the courtyard. From head to toe, he is encased in shining, interlocking plates of steel. His face is hidden behind a heavy steel visor. According to everything pop culture, Hollywood, and Victorian historians have taught us, this man is a walking coffin. We expect him to plod forward with heavy, robotic, agonizingly slow steps. We expect that to get onto his horse, a team of squires will have to hoist him into the air using a complex system of wooden cranes and pulleys. Instead, the knight drops to the ground. He executes a flawless, fluid forward roll over the hard cobblestones. He instantly pops back onto his feet, breaks into a full sprint, does a cartwheel, and flawlessly vaults directly into the saddle of his massive warhorse without using stirrups. He does not move like a robot. He moves like an elite Olympic gymnast. The myth of the slow, clunky knight hoisted by a crane is a complete historical fabrication. It was a misconception popularized in the 19th century by Victorian historians who confused specialized, ultra-heavy jousting armor, which was designed exclusively for a highly controlled, high-impact sporting event, with actual battlefield combat armor. To wear jousting armor into a real battle would be biological suicide. But true 15th century battlefield plate armor, specifically the Gothic full plate forged in the master workshops of Milan and southern Germany, was not a clunky iron shell. It was the absolute, undisputed pinnacle of human biomechanics. It was a custom-fitted, highly articulated exoskeleton that hacked the laws of physics and completely neutralized the kinetic energy of the deadliest weapons on Earth. To achieve this, the master armorers had to abandon the brute force philosophy of the ancient world. They realized that you cannot simply make metal thicker to absorb heavy blows. They had to turn steel into a mathematical equation. By the late 15th century, the arms race was reaching a catastrophic peak. The battlefield was dominated by heavy crossbows, early gunpowder hand cannons, and the poleaxe, a massive, armor-crushing hammer swung on a 6-foot wooden lever. If a knight wearing a flat, solid breastplate was struck by a poleaxe, the sheer kinetic energy of the swing would crush his ribcage through the metal, instantly liquefying his lungs. To survive, the armorers had to drastically increase the structural rigidity of the steel. But if they made the steel thicker, the knight would be too heavy to move. So, the German armorers deployed a brilliant geometrical hack. They introduced the fluting. If you look closely at a suit of Gothic plate, you will see highly deliberate, elegant ridges and grooves hammered vertically into the steel of the breastplate, the arms, and the thighs. This was not decorative. It was applied physics. If you take a flat piece of paper, it bends easily. If you fold that paper into a zigzag corrugated pattern, it suddenly becomes incredibly rigid and can support massive amounts of weight. The Gothic armorers corrugated their steel. By hammering ridges into the metal, they exponentially increased its structural strength without adding a single ounce of mass. But fluting was only the first half of the equation. The true genius of Gothic plate armor lay in its ability to manipulate the trajectory of an enemy's weapon. The armorers stopped trying to absorb kinetic energy. They decided to deflect it. Every single surface on a flawless suit of Gothic armor is mathematically convex. There is not a single flat target on the entire body. The breastplate curves outward into a pronounced rounded dome. The shoulder pauldrons slope downward. The helmet slopes aggressively toward the back of the neck. This convex geometry created the ultimate glancing surface. When an enemy soldier swung a heavy poleaxe down at the knight's chest, the weapon did not strike a flat plane. The microsecond the heavy steel hammer head made contact with the domed breastplate, the geometry of the armor physically forced the weapon to slip. The kinetic energy had nowhere to bite. The hammer would instantly skate off the curved steel, violently redirecting the lethal, bone-crushing momentum of the swing away from the knight's body and harmlessly into the empty air. The armor did not fight the weapon. It redirected it. The knight was entirely protected by the invisible mathematics of the curve, but an impenetrable defense is useless if the warrior cannot move. The most staggering achievement of the Gothic armorers was not how they manipulated the metal, but how they mapped the human body. A full suit of 15th century plate armor weighs approximately 45 to 60 pounds. To a modern civilian, carrying 60 pounds sounds exhausting, but the genius of the armor was how that weight was biologically distributed. When a modern backpacker carries 60 pounds of gear, 100% of that weight is resting on two localized biological points: their shoulders and their hips. The weight is a parasitic mass, constantly pulling backward against the spine, destroying the hiker's center of gravity and rapidly draining their caloric reserves. A suit of plate armor does not sit on the shoulders. The armor was painstakingly, microscopically tailored to the exact millimeter of the specific knight's body. The weight of the steel boots, sabatons, rested on the ground. The weight of the leg plates, greaves and cuisses, was strapped to the calves and thighs. The weight of the breastplate was belted tightly to the hips. The 60 pounds of mass was perfectly, mathematically dispersed across the entire human skeleton. Furthermore, the joints of the armor, the elbows, the knees, the shoulders, were constructed using sliding rivets and overlapping steel lames. This meant the metal plates slid effortlessly over one another, perfectly mimicking the complex biological articulation of the human joints beneath them. When the knight moved, the armor did not fight his biology. It moved with him like a second skin. Because the weight was universally distributed, a highly conditioned 15th century knight felt virtually no encumbrance. His center of gravity was flawless. He could sprint, grapple, and roll with terrifying speed. We know this is an absolute scientifically verified fact, because modern kinesiologists recently decided to pit a 15th century knight against a 21st century soldier. Researchers from the University of Geneva and the University of Leeds conducted a groundbreaking biomechanical experiment. They took highly conditioned modern athletes. First, they dressed them in flawless, historically accurate 60-pound replicas of 15th century full-plate armor. They put them on treadmills, tracking their oxygen consumption, caloric burn rate, and stride biomechanics. Then, they took those same athletes, stripped off the medieval armor, and handed them the standard modern combat loadout of a 21st century infantryman: Kevlar vest, ammunition, rucksack, and assault rifle. The modern gear weighed roughly 100 pounds. When the researchers analyzed the biological data, the results completely shattered our modern perception of military supremacy. The athletes running in the 15th century steel plate armor burned significantly fewer calories, exhibited vastly superior mobility, and suffered far less biomechanical strain than they did while carrying the modern combat loadout. The 600-year-old medieval armor was biologically, ergonomically, and kinetically superior to the gear currently worn by modern soldiers on the front lines today. And this leads us to a profoundly unsettling realization. For the past 60 minutes, we have watched ancient engineers bypass the biological limits of the human body. We have seen them weave non-Newtonian coconut armor. We have seen them manipulate evaporative cooling to defeat the jungle heat. We have seen them biomimetically copy bird feathers, build load-bearing Bronze Age exoskeletons, and forge steel into mathematical deflecting surfaces. They pushed the biological human engine to absolute perfection. So what happened to us?